Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that part 2 stand part. Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on part 2, which is the consequential amendments, the application, savings and transitional provisions. So the intent of this part, of course, is to go about the implementation of the clauses that we've just really been debating. And so this is the part of the Act that will bring about the, we think on this side of the House, quite precedent-setting issue around not having had to have that high bar of proving criminal liability when it comes to being involved in social security fraud, or being involved in the part payment of debt that has been that has come about from someone being in receipt of a benefit. And I think, as some of my colleagues quite rightly pointed out, actually the fraud and the debt parts should be treated quite separately, and I thank Jan Logie for raising that in the Part 1 discussion, because obviously debt, when it comes to social security, can actually, and often does, and this is something that I'm hearing about on a daily basis now, can often come about because of a mistake that has been made by the department itself, by work and income. And quite frequently that is the case, that I'm certainly hearing about on a daily basis now in my role as the spokesperson for social development for the Labour Party. So these consequential amendments and the transitional provisions are actually very important, because we are transitioning to a situation that is unprecedented. And I heard what the Minister said in his contribution to the Part 1 debate. He doesn't believe that there is a great precedent being set here, but that certainly wasn't the view of the New Zealand Law Society. I think they were quite right in bringing forward their concerns about how these amendments to a range of other Acts of Parliament and these transitional provisions are actually a departure from what we've had before, and their concern in particular was the departure brought about in these consequential amendments to other Acts of Parliament that will, for the first time, they thought, and we agreed with them, it will actually lower, really, the bar of proof that a person was actively engaged in committing the fraud or accumulating the debt, because remembering this bill deals with both. So, when work and income do overpay someone and that person may not know about it, can we really expect the person in a relationship with them to know about a mistake made by the department? Because that's what this bill is actually saying, that we ought to transition to under Part 2, that the transitional provisions will actually transition to a place where the partner of the person who's been overpaid because of a mistake made by work and income doesn't even have to, we wouldn't even have to prove that they knew that there had been an overpayment. The fact that they benefited from that overpayment is enough with regard to their criminal liability, and that, I think, is quite a departure. So we are transitioning in Part 2 to deal with issues of welfare fraud and welfare debt, but the government, despite its protestations, is not taking a consistent approach when it comes to fraud from tax fraud. And I think that is completely wrong. It's completely wrong that we've got a government that's prepared to, well, Minister, I can keep saying it because it's the truth. The truth is that these measures here in this bill are not being taken with regard to with tax. Well, where is the bill, Minister? Where is the bill that actually takes these same measures against people who commit corporate tax fraud? Well, all the Minister can talk about is how much this government spends. I'd rather that minister spoke about how much work this government's doing on finding jobs for these beneficiaries instead of actually attacking them all the time, because that's what the government, Mr Chair, that is what the government should be spending its time doing, should be actually focusing, and I would much more welcome transitional provisions that were actually transitioning beneficiaries into jobs. That would be a real relief, actually, because unfortunately what's happening is the opposite, that this government, instead of focusing on getting people off benefits and into jobs and actually helping to create those jobs, they instead are putting all their energy into trying to deal with welfare fraud as if that's the big issue. As if that is the big issue. And of course none of us accept that any level of fraud, particularly when it's fraud that is taken against the taxpayer, and that's both tax fraud and welfare fraud, by the way, both of those measures are fraud against the taxpayer. No one in this House accepts that that's okay. But I would much rather, Mr Chair, that this government and that minister put their energy into actual social development, because that's what the name of the portfolio is, developing people's opportunity to be socially engaged, not spending all their energy on this area here, which is all about proving that people who are welfare dependent are actually the bad guys, that they're the bad guys, and the job of the government is to actually catch them out. Well, look, it's a small part of what the government should be doing, but the big part of what the government should be doing is actually helping people get off benefits and into work. And sadly, not enough effort is being put into that area, but an awful lot of effort is putting into blaming beneficiaries, and an awful lot of effort is being put into trying to make it seem as if fraud and welfare fraud is the big bogey that this country faces. This is not the big bogey that this country faces. However, I want to put it on record again that the Labor Party is supporting this bill because we don't accept that fraud against the taxpayer at any level is acceptable, whether it be tax fraud or whether it be welfare fraud. So we are supporting it on that basis. We were also very much swayed, as I said when I spoke on part one, very much swayed by what women's organisations had to say about the gender impacts of welfare fraud, and how this, we think, and we do strongly believe, having heard the submissions, that this will actually make it more equitable, that where there is relationship fraud that's been committed, and part two deals with the amendments to other bills that will help to bring this about, that it should be, if two people have been benefiting from that fraud, then there should be more equality in what they pay in restitution towards that. So we absolutely agree with that. We think that that should be more equitable, and we believe that women who are in these situations, which as we said before, could very well be violent situations, that they are protected as well, and that's important, and this bill does go some way towards this. But let's not imagine for a minute that this bill addresses the big problems that this country faces, the big problems that could have been resolved if this government had been working in the interests of beneficiaries rather than just trying to trip them up and attack them at every opportunity. If this government had really had the interests of beneficiaries at heart, then we wouldn't have largely immigrant labour rebuilding Christchurch at the moment, for example. That is something that the government should have had its eye on. It should have been training people. And it didn't. It failed to do that. So it would rather focus on the fraud measures and debt recovery from beneficiaries instead. Mr Chair, I am going to conclude this debate by saying that the Labor Party will support the provisions in Part 2 as we did in Part 1, but we urge the government to not just take the simple way out with this. It's okay, the government may feel it's okay to attack beneficiaries and actually put these measures on them, but we want to see some equity in this. We want to see the provisions in Part 2 and Part 1 applied to tax, and particularly to corporate tax fraud as well. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Considerable debate going on in this House as to whether or not